Right, good morning, grade 11s. Nice to be with you. Sorry we can't be together in person, but it is what it is. Hopefully, we will be back together soon. So, I thought I'd start with a little bit of a video just to set the scene. The work we're doing this term is called Nationalism or Introduction to Nationalism, and then we're going to focus on African nationalism, obviously, nationalism in Africa. But today, I just want to set the scene, talk a little bit about the concept of nationalism and imperialism and how it applies to what we're going to study. Okay, so I think the first thing is to understand that nationalism is not a natural concept. We tend to think of it as being natural. It's far from it. And we have to have some idea of how and why it came about. So I think the first off is that nationalism without industrialization would have been extremely difficult. Because of industrialization, people flocked to towns and cities. In other words, there was urbanization, and they lived close together. They also then shared a common identity of people that lived in a particular town or city. And that, again, led to the belief that they were united in other ways as well. So I want to be very clear the difference between nationalism and imperialism. So nationalism, we understand, is a strong pride and belief in your country such that you're prepared to defend it or stand by it. And imperialism goes a stage further. It is when you believe that your country and your set of beliefs, your religion, is so superior to others that you have the right to take over their land or force your beliefs on them. And that is imperialism. Okay, so imperialism is not nationalism, but you can't have imperialism without nationalism. In other words, if British people didn't feel very strongly about being British, they would never have launched the imperial empire that they had, and they wouldn't have had Canada and Australia and America and South Africa and Kenya and you name it as colonies. Okay, so industrialization, urbanization, and imperialism. And then we're also going to look just very briefly in more detail later on. The reaction to imperialism led to its own form of nationalism. In other words, we understand by the end of the 19th century, the 1800s, and the early 20th century, the 1900s, that there were many colonies in Africa. In fact, all of Africa except two countries were colonized. And it was nationalism where people with different ethnicities came together in order to oppose the colonial power. So, for example, the Matabele and the Shona in what was then Rhodesia worked together and became nationalistic to overthrow their British rulers. Zimbabwe then, Rhodesia, it was known then, was obviously a British colony. Okay, so when we look at the origins of nationalism, in other words, where did nationalism really start or come from? And we're focusing on Europe because European nationalism and later imperialism had a big effect on Africa. One starts with the collapse of the feudal system. So you used to have loyalty to a lord, and when that fell away, there was nothing really to take its place. And people started to then push to this idea that you must show loyalty to a country. Up until this point, prior to, say, the French Revolution, that didn't really exist. Another big factor is the emergence of an educated middle class. They had no identity in the feudal system. They weren't part of the feudal system. And as the feudal system broke down, they needed to get a common sense of identity. They were educated, they were wealthy, they had time and money to promote a cause, and the cause that many of them adopted, such as the French philosophers, was this whole idea of nationalism and pride and belief in your country. Industrialization also meant that people now worked in factories and they needed a common sense of identity, and that common sense of identity could no longer be allegiance to a feudal lord, and that obviously led to feudalism as well. I think there are probably 5 key events in the development of nationalism, which I'm just going to touch on briefly. Arguably, I think the main one would have been what happened in the 18th century, the French Revolution. We understand that the absolute monarchy was overthrown, the king was eventually assassinated, and people developed a strong sense of protecting France. And this is a new idea throughout Europe at this time. And then, of course, during the Napoleonic Wars, that was taken to new heights, where people got behind Napoleon and France in order to defeat other European countries. It also led to countries like Britain becoming patriotic to oppose France in the Napoleonic Wars. Number two was the whole idea of American War of Independence. Up until this point, American citizens had seen themselves as being British, but in a foreign country. But over a long period of time, they started to associate more being American, and they didn't want to be ruled by what to them were now foreigners, Britain. So that was a big movement of nationalism, and we know, of course, that the Americans were successful in the War of Independence and became their own country. Number three over here, we've touched on already, the whole idea of the Industrial Revolution, people living close together, and people developing, needing a new sense of loyalty in these towns and cities, seeing they no longer had loyalty to a feudal lord. Number four, we've also touched on in the 19th century, the 1800s, the early 19th century, there was a huge wave of British patriotism. People came together as British citizens to defeat Napoleon. And this obviously led to Britain herself wanting to expand her empire and the creation of colonies. And then also we're just going to touch on very briefly in the 19th century, we tend to think of Europe as it is today, where there's a Germany and there's an Italy and there's a France. But up until the 19th century, there was no Germany. There were a number of Germanic states who were loosely bound together by language, the same with Italy. And we see now that in Germany and Italy, these smaller states combining to form one country, one nation, and nationalism came out of that. Okay, and then there's this whole idea, this chap here on the left, his name is Benedict Anderson, and he proposed a theory way back in 1983 that has largely been taken on by other historians and socialists. And just in a nutshell, we tend to think of South Africa, for example, as being a natural boundary. It stops at the Limpopo River in the north and to the sea to the south. It's bound by the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. And we feel strongly that we are one nation. But as he's quite rightly pointed out, it's an imagined community. Imagined in the sense that there's no conceivable reason why our country should stop at the Limpopo River. Why didn't it stop a little further up? Why didn't the Cape become its own country and stop at, say, the Orange Gerib River? So the whole idea of imagined communities is a concept that it's socially constructed. In other words, humans have made nationalism, and governments have then exploited this. So they talk about the traditions of Nelson Mandela to get us feel very strongly as South Africans and want to protect South Africa. They'll talk about the heroism of the Roman Empire to get Italians to believe that they are one people. But this whole idea that a nation is a natural order is incorrect in the view of Benedict Anderson. He proposes that it's constructed by humankind in order to exploit people. Okay, so I'm just going to go through another source here. So I'm going to a little bit of repetition, but I won't be long. So the concept of nationalism had a long history. We've touched on that. Its origins tend to lie in Europe, as we've discussed. I think I must also point out at first it was a beneficial force. In other words, it had a positive impact because it brought people together. One can argue, for example, in France, how necessary that was to defeat the evils of feudalism and a very corrupt absolute monarchy. But we also know by the 20th century, the 1900s, it became a very destructive force. Somewhere between 100 and 140 million people died in World War I and World War II, and that was very much due to nationalism. We're going to look at the Middle East and the awful fighting that still goes on today between the Israeli and the Palestinians, the two religions, the Muslim faith and the Jewish faith, and how destructive that has been. So when we look at the origin of nationalism, and I'm just going to touch on this very briefly because we've done it, we talk about the American Revolution in the 18th century, 1776 to be precise, people fighting for their freedom. The French Revolution, where people fought as Frenchmen to escape the tyranny of absolute monarchy. The Napoleonic Wars, where the idea of nationalism was exported to other countries, and other countries became nationalistic in order to oppose Napoleon and the French Revolution. We're not going to spend any time on the Congress of Vienna yet, but where it was an attempt to put conservative monarchies back in power, which is anti-nationalism. And then we spoke also about uprising in Europe that removed monarchies. It wasn't only France. Italy became a United Nations in 1859 and Germany in 1871. And then arguably the worst of nationalism, the whole idea of the First and Second World Wars that resulted in so many deaths. Almost there. So if we look, there's the link to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution mechanized and increased production. The demand for markets grew. Factory owners wanted economic freedom and government support to compete on international markets. In other words, they wanted to sell their goods overseas. And competition with other nations increased their sense of pride. They're trying to produce more wool in Britain than they could in France. And that, of course, later led to this belief that you could take over weaker countries to get the raw materials and markets that you need to be competitive. The rise of the middle class, which we've also touched on, society was completely restructured. The educated middle class began demanding political rights. And as a center of wealth moved to the industrial towns and cities, the aristocracy was forced to share political power with the middle class, who became more powerful in many European countries. The nationalist movement was supported by the working class, but they wanted something far more fundamental or basic. They weren't so much interested in the concept of nationalism, but they wanted better living and working conditions, and came together as French people or British people in order to get that. And then this idea of the imagined community, it was first argued by Benedict Anderson in 1983. Many economists and socialists and historians have picked up on it. A nation is a community imagined by a group of people living together. I want to repeat that. A nation is a community imagined by a group of people living together. Because they share a common identity, a common history, a common tradition. The printed word was important to the rise of nationalism. Print nationalism spread as people read books. Think of how Hitler used books and propaganda and other written means to indoctrinate the German people. And then an example is the North American colonies. The written constitution laid the foundation of the American nation. Okay, the final thing that I want you to do is to watch the video that I've attached. It's a John Green crash course video. Then have a look at the images I've put, and then you will complete the quiz that I've loaded as a separate thing.